hope everybody's recovered from their various forms of jet lag, various degrees of jet lag, I should say. We're going to go ahead and get started with the first panel. And hopefully our discussant will arrive. Otherwise, we will all, a lot of us, most of us have read the paper, so I think it's going. We have three great panels again today that, for those of you who might have not been here yesterday, which will follow the same kind of rubric where we have two papers from scholars of Russia that will be presented that are going to be commented on by a scholar from outside the Russian field. And the idea is for that to kind of set the tone for the level of discussion that we have, and that is to say that it's not a matter of necessarily digging deeper and deeper and deeper into the specifics of the Russian field, but to extract from the research that our Russianists have done in such a way that the conversation is being had across fields, right, and try to put Russia in a broader discussion and to try to gauge, how is this being read outside of the Russian field? How are we dealing with the question of race and so on? So without further ado, I'll let Ann Lounsbery, our chair, introduce our next reader.
Hi everybody, I'm Ann Lounsbery from NYU Russian Slavic Studies, and we have two presenters, Chia from Portland State University, and Edyta Bojanowska from Rutgers University. And I guess you're going to speak in the order that it is in the program. Okay. Sure, thank you.
So I guess I'll just begin to explaining how I got to doing the paper, which is that I started looking at research because of the people mentioned in immigrant writings, Russian immigrant writings, who got deposited in manuscript and published works either in Russia or in the U.S., deposited their manuscripts in U.S. archives, general archives. And I found that in these writings very often, you got just a little, of course, in these writings there are often very effusive and fond memories of these resorts, railway resorts, which were built all around this railroad network. Most of it is around the Genesis Railroad, which was built by the Russians at the end of the 19th century. So the context for these resorts, for studying these resorts for me, was that it seemed to me they were part of a broader movement of democratization of nature. And this is generally a European-wide movement, which also reached Japan. And so this movement to democratize holiday travel and leisure, to transform holiday leisure activities into a kind of democratic is what one scholar called a transformation from a regime of privilege, leisure activities, to a regime of access, popular access. So this was occurring in the 1920s. But these resorts in Manchuria, which were created in 1920, and many of them in the early 1920s, and those in the Soviet Far East were very early, but especially the ones in Manchuria, were either created around almost the same time as the other kinds of institutions that resulted from this movement, or preceded them. For instance, the better known examples of these democratization of leisure were created during the interwar period, the Dopolavoro of the fascist Italians, Kraftovoida of the Germans, and the Conjugué of the popular France. So these occurred around the late 20s, 1930s. So the Manchurian resorts were created from 1920 onwards, so they preceded the Not only was there a slight difference in chronology, to me the Manchurian resorts seem to have differed from these other iterations of leisure democratization, in that they were not just a regime of access, they were also a regime of privilege. So the conjoining of these two regimes, whereas the other democratization movement is a shift from a regime of privilege to access. Here, they're both privilege and access. So the conjoining of these two regimes is what led to my exploration of race. So given this setting, what I ask is, what is the meaning of privilege, and what is its relationship to whiteness and Europeanness in this setting? So I consider here race in relation to Europeanness and race as a way of performing Europeanness, a way of being, acting. And so here performance is not performance of otherness. The other here is completely silent. It's not performing at all. It's passive. But of the self, and not just any self, but of the normative self. A self that had been construed as normative in a setting. Since these resorts were very much part of the railroad network, they were also tied for me to the modernity pervaded by the railroad. And what for me is part of this modernity is the production of various types of knowledge, in particular ethnographic knowledge. It is the modernity of this Europeanness, or sort of railroad network, and a sort of modernity pervading is also the constitution of a pair of conceptual categories. And in this case, one is tacit, that is the category of Europeanness or / whiteness. And the other one is explicit, which is indigeneity. And in a sense, the modernity here constitutes both Europeanness and indigeneity. And they kind of, in order to have indigeneity, you have to have Europeanness. In order to have Europeanness, you have to have indigeneity. So this is what I try to understand how this happens. The resort, in a way, secures the idea of Europeanness, or at least it pervades it. The ethnographic museums, the ethnographic writings talk about indigeneity. And the two realms come together in railroad travel. Because as you travel through the railroad, the Russian, in Manchuria, you sometimes step off to go to a resort, sometimes step off to go to a monastery, sometimes step off to go to a museum. All these different sites are connected together and made sense of. So there is epistemological order. And in this order, there's a kind of formation of new subjectivity, a subjectivity of a sense of Russianness that, in fact, I would say never existed in Russia before, but it's still Russian. Methodology. The performance of self, for me, is intertwines race with other categories, gender and class, of course, but also ethnographic knowledge, and factors that are not ostensibly decentralizing, such as leisure activities. And sometimes I think they all work together. And to use a kind of genetic trait, in various degrees of prominence and specificity. Sometimes gender is more prominent, sometimes class is more prominent, but they're all there. They all work together. And sometimes being able to carry out sort of sailing on a river, in a particular ski, or these are certain kinds of performative activities that has gender connotations, race connotations, class connotations. But here the activity is more prominent. So they shift in prominence. But they work together. So it's in this way that there are multiple fashions that Europeanness is defined. And this is what I sort of been trying to get at. So the last thing I want to say is the conflation, or what might be seen as the conflation between the two terms, Russianness and Europeanness, Russian and European. here, I follow a little bit what Emmanuel Wallerstein talks about. He talks about status groups. And he borrows from Max Weber, using the term status groups. So Max Weber's status groups is, he used it to refer to estates. But he then defines it as a kind of community that sees itself as belonging together. And that belonging together dates back to seemingly forever. And it could be because they follow the same occupation, they do things the same way, or they have certain habits in common. But it could be various. Estate groups are an example for Weber. So Wallerstein takes that, and talking about post-colonial Africa, and says actually race and nation are also status groups. So in that way, for me, Russianness and Europeanness are status groups. And so that's really, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave, for inviting me to this workshop, and thank you all for your wonderful papers. I've learned so much about race at this workshop. It's really amazing. And as requested by the organizers, I won't summarize my points, but instead I'll try to offer some framing comments that put my paper in conversation with some of the discussions that we've been having so far. And I wanted to say I reread my paper last night just to remind myself what it is that I'm talking about. And you know, the paper is really overloaded with examples, and I wanted to apologize for that kind of concentration of examples. This is still, you know, an early draft stage, and I need much more sort of a narrative glide into this material, which isn't quite there yet. But maybe I'll start by showing just a couple of images that I have a lot, but I know I have only very few minutes. So this is an image of the Pallada, of the Russian frigate, drawn by the Japanese. I wanted to show you a map of the journey that Goncharov undertook. As you can see, from St. Petersburg, stopped in Portsmouth, trip to London, Madeira, Cape Town, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then lots of sort of shuttling back and forth around between Ryukyu Islands, Manila, Japan, Shanghai. Then they sail up the coast of Korea. There's a little bit of exploration of the Amur happening. And then Goncharov disembarks in Ayan and then travels overland through Yakutsk to Irkutsk. And Irkutsk is where the travelogue stops, and then the dotted line is the part of the journey that isn't part of the travel guide. But that's basically, I mean, it's an unprecedented itinerary for a Russian writer in the 19th century. I would say, just maybe a word about their larger project. So this is part of a book manuscript I'm completing. It's called The Colonial World Through Russian Eyes. And what I basically do is that I take this travelogue and I make it into a lens, a Russian lens, onto a larger 19th century colonial world around 1830. So it isn't a book just about Goncharov's book. It isn't a book about Russian imperialism. It is a book about a global imperial world of which Russia is an integral part. So my contribution to our discussion today, as I see it, is that when discussing race in Russia, we really need to look beyond scholarly discourse. We need to look beyond imperial administration and examine the realm of popular culture. For the popular culture is the vehicle that carried racial understandings of human difference into the mentality of the broader public. As one of the people I cite in the paper put it, racism knows no division between the sciences and the arts. So now within popular culture, travel literature in particular deserves special attention. In the 19th century, travel literature served the narrative needs of the readers, but was also the principal source of knowledge about the larger world. So it had the narrative and a sort of knowledge function and combined both. And in addition to gripping narrative, travel books were the 19th century equivalent of the National Geographic, the Reader's Digest, the Travel Channel, and the Popular History book, all wrapped into one. Travel literature enjoyed huge popularity everywhere, including in Russia. And those of us who work with journals will know that rarely can you pick up an issue of a thick journal without some kind of travel account in it. Another thing I found out is that early pioneers of racial science were voracious readers of travel accounts, which they got some of their intimations about races from travel accounts. And conversely, travel narratives helped carry racial theories into help propagate racial theories of the scholars. And I think this propagating role is what we need to think about when we read the Frigate Pallada. In it, we find casual deployment of racialized representations, ample layers of racial prejudice, often validated through humor, clear racial hierarchies, abhorrence of white-black mixing, even though miscegenation in Siberia was viewed more permissively. Lower races are often animalized and debased. And in this, Goncharov's book is pretty much in the mainstream of European racial discourse, of popular writing of this sort, and certainly no exception to it. And so my paper supports approaches to 19th century racial thought in Russia as articulated by Vera Tolz and Karl Hall, which stress the contiguity between European and Russian developments. And I'd also like to, did I have another image? Oh, okay. Oh, this is, so I forgot to show you another image. The chubby guy in gray, that's Goncharov, I see by the Japanese. So anyway, another point I'd like to make is I'd like to relate the evidence of this travelogue to Nathaniel Knight's ideas about the 4 stages of racial discourse. And Nathaniel claims that prior to the last decades of the 19th century, most of it oscillated between levels 1 and 2, we'll talk about it in the next panel, rarely really ripening into the kind of biologized racial discourse he terms level 3, when, and I quote, physical traits denoting group identity are linked to less tangible features reflecting the worth of the individual, and unquote. So Nathaniel is saying that we really see that mostly in these last 2 decades of the 19th century. But I would say that here in this 1850s travelogue, level 3 pretty much reigns supreme, I would say. So now, if this is an exception, and Nathaniel phrases this point very carefully to allow for that possibility, I would say that this is still a pretty big one. The Frigate Pallada is not just any random 19th century Russian book. For literary writers such as Goncharov, and this is actually true of Mark Twain, travel literature was the equivalent of a writer getting a Hollywood movie contract. It meant money, it meant dissemination, it meant social impact. So here's some dissemination data for the Frigate Pallada. I discovered that by the end of the 19th century, the book was more popular than Oblomov, which is the text that now, to which Goncharov now owes his place in the Russian canon. It had 16 journal appearances over and above those of Oblomov. It appeared in 10 book editions by 1900. Oblomov appeared in 6. This apparently hardly met the actual demand. The long-term monopoly on the copyright, in fact, kept the book out of reach for many. The travelogue was widely reviewed by such prominent cultural commentators as Dobrolyubov, Pisarev, Chernyshevsky, and Herzen. Its popularity was unmatched for the remainder of the century alongside Pushkin's Puteshествие в Арзрум. This book became the model for all subsequent travel writing, including the governmentally sponsored one. Young Chekhov read it and then reread it when going on his trip to Sakhalin. The Orientalist painter Vereshchagin was obsessed with it. Nabokov mentions this book in The Defense as staple of middle-brow pre-revolutionary reading. I'm not finished. The Soviet party leader Kalinin in 1934 recommended this to non-Soviet writers. Brezhnev mentions it in his autobiography. Shklovsky spoke of this book as a book that, and I quote, for 2 centuries has never left readers' desks. And Goncharov himself called it his own favorite. He called it a rose without thorns. So, the book was widely read by regular readers and government officials, both adults and young kids. It was taught in schools. It helped generations, it shaped generations of Russian writers and their sense of the larger world well into the Soviet period. And in fact, so influential was Goncharov's reckless condescension towards Asians, for example, that some historians have blamed it for contributing to Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Okay, the historian in question is George Lanson. So in short, if you're interested in connections between literature and history, as I am, this is a book for you. So I think, when we think about race in Russia, we need to think what it meant for generations of Russians, including our readers, to be basically raised on books like this one. And a perhaps more perplexing question might be, how come that Russian critics up to the present day, and I mean the post-Soviet times, continue to praise this book as the exemplar of Russian humanism and tolerance? And I think some of our discussions yesterday revolved around the question, well, why should we talk about race? And I think I'd like to flip that question around as well to something like, what do we lose by not talking about it? And I think that I would argue that this kind of prejudices of Frigate Pallada is what precisely would go under the scholarly radar if we don't talk about race in this book. So anyway, maybe I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our discussant is Pizzigoni from Colonial University.
Yes, and I will start with sincere apologies. I didn't know it was going to be such an adventure to come from uptown. I left at 9, and there was an investigation in the subway, so we were detained and then thrown out on the street, and there were no taxis. So I made it, but sorry, because most of you probably came from much farther. So I'm really embarrassed. I don't know what else to say. So apologies for my panelists here, but also then thanks to David for inviting me. Thanks to everybody, because my perspective is the one of a colonial Latin American historian, so I'm completely out of my water here, and I've been learning so much from reading the papers. I greatly enjoyed them, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you yesterday, because it's clear from what I read that I was going to learn a great deal from yesterday as well. So I'm joining you for the day, and I thought of doing something just for a few minutes in terms of what the papers made me think of, reading them together, thinking of some common threads that I could see, thinking of the Russian experience, and as I was invited to do, thinking of it from my point of view. So what it is that we can see when we then bring it into comparison would be too big of a term, right? Because different times, there's different places, but the first thing that I kind of thought of is both papers made me think of how, I really had to step out of what I always thought of being Russian exceptionalism and thinking exactly that when Russians think of colonization, they do it in a different way from European empires, and the similarities, in fact, of that experience in both, for both papers. I also thought that the reference point, understandably so, for both papers is the European imperial experiences of the British or the French or the Germans, mainly, I would say, broadly, the 19th century experiences of colonization, right? I come from another perspective, it's much earlier, right? The Spanish Empire and colonization that happened between the end of the 15th and the beginning of, really the beginning of the 16th century. And so I started thinking, what if we shift that to that perspective, to much earlier and another kind of colonization? What is it that we see when we think of Russia? And one thing that I was thinking of, there are like three main points, I would say. One thing that struck me is how both papers present this imperial or post-imperial Russia as conceived as modernity, as progress and a civilizing mission whenever then the Russians encounter the other, if you want to call it that, can be African, Asian, broadly defined, or Chinese. And of course, the Spanish thought very much in terms of civilizing missions already much earlier in time. But one element that I thought was really essential for the civilizing mission of the Spanish when they encountered indigenous people of Latin America is the role of the church and religion. It was really, you couldn't just separate that. It was an essential component of the civilizing mission, a complicated one because, of course, the religious people involved in that contributed to perpetuating these labels attached to the other as barbarian or primitive or primordial, but also in many ways contributed to trying to preserve basic rights for these barbarians. And they learn their languages, so it's a multi-layered and very complex way of dealing with the other. And then I would have a kind of very general question in terms of the role their religion and or the church plays in this story, in these stories of Russia and race relations. In different time periods, and I understand your periods are different, but if at all is an element to consider. Another thing I was thinking of is, of course, as you put it, what is the Russians meant by race back in the periods of your two papers. And one thing that struck me reading both papers is this, the predominance of this, of the biological aspect of race. That I think was also very much explained in Edyta's paper that I enjoy reading both and then thinking of the references that you have there in terms of thinking of race as biological. And again, bringing it back in time and to the experience of race for the Spanish and the Latin Americans that I have a look at. Race for Spain was pretty much an issue of lineage and religion once again. So it's the Christian ancestors and the purity of blood defined by that. Much more than anything that is scientific or biological. And then when it gets to Latin America, race becomes really, on one side, associated very much with Spanishness, and Spanishness is phenotype and cultural, is this weird mixing that is always difficult to pin down, but it's very, because it's difficult to pin down, it's very flexible. So it can be stretched in many different directions. And it is very much tied to what happens in the colonial space. So to the kind of classes and the socioeconomic conditions that are developed on the ground, and very, very much to miscegenation. So I'm glad that you both brought up this term, because the mixing of races is what creates all sorts of classifications and needs to think about race. And so I was thinking of what miscegenations and the degrees of miscegenations does for your stories of Russia, Imperial Russia, and post-Imperial Russia, because it is there, but the Spanish got kind of obsessed with creating a taxonomy of degrees. So miscegenation was allowed, but then you also have to control it and you have to classify it. So I kept thinking about that, and one example that came through papers is of one reference that I had in mind was Siberia, also because of David's work, and I'm sorry that I missed your presentation yesterday. And of course, our miscegenation there is kind of allowed if then the children and the partner become Orthodox, if they are brought in. So I was just thinking of how, you know, if we think of miscegenation and we compare it to other empires, what we can find in terms of the specific case for Russia, or if Russia stands out in a particular way. Let me just add two more very quickly. Another thing that I thought was fascinating is this anxiety of affiliation with the barbarian, or the primitive, or the primordial, the kind of strategies that are put into place to try to prevent that or keep it under control, keep the anxiety under control, as a matter of fact. And both papers have very interesting strategies that are played out there, portraying the other, I keep using it as abject, of course, or saying that people other than the Russians, so other people that are considered more savages or savages, consider particular people as more savages than themselves. So it's not only, it's not the prejudice of something that is European, also people outside of Europe have this sort of way of seeing other people, or portraying the other as a subject of an ethnographic study or displayed in a museum, coming from people who have better knowledge, so they are the ones who can classify and display. And I was thinking of Latin America, and that is something that is very peculiar actually, and this the Creoles of Latin America, the born and raised in Latin America, but essentially white or Spanish, have a particular strategy that is the one of genealogy, going back to the genealogy all the time. So So genealogy of descent, the fact that you can trace your ancestors and you don't come from some of these people and you can prove it. And so I was thinking of what if genealogy, common ancestry, any discourse of that nature has a role in races when we think of how they are played in the Russian context. Then I end with gender, that I'm very happy that Chia, that Chia brought up, because one thing that you find in all narratives of the encounter with the other is most of the time the other is presented as weak and therefore, how do you call it, effeminate, thank you, sometimes my English pronunciation is off. And that happens pretty much with the Spanish and indigenous people as well. And in the Spanish context, it happens also in a context where both the legal and the cultural environment is one in which women are limited and controlled because it's a patriarchal society. Then it plays out in practical terms in different ways. But so I was trying to think of gender in the context of race, classification, and relations, and how it attaches to patriarchal society. I know nothing of Russian society, if they can be like that, but I think that there are important gender dynamics there. And then I would just conclude with a thought more than open questions. And of course, I think we all think about that when we think of race, that in order to think of race, you need somebody that is different, as you put it here at the end. You need the Europeans and you need the natives, right? And I was also thinking, yeah, these are two fundamental elements of the race equation. Then we also need the space, and also the time a colonized space is the one where race relations are become more evident. But then I was also thinking that what we need is a public, is an audience there that acknowledges your standing, right? So it's not only the other against whom you define yourself, but then you need other people around you who agrees and acknowledge that they see themselves in that definition, right? So you just need your own audience that is on your side, because if it's you, it's not very relevant. So I'm sorry, they're very random thoughts, but you really gave me so much to think of when I think of my own research, so I'm very grateful for being here, and I'm sorry if it's kind of scattered brain, but I'll just leave it at there. Is that enough time? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the remarks. Maybe we'll let the presenters respond to some of the questions first, and then I'll open the floor.
If you would.
Go ahead, Chia.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the first question is about this idea of civilization, the role of the church. What is the comparative element for my paper here?
So I speak up.
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
I like to talk. It's too early. So the role of the church is in fact extremely important, and I'm glad you brought it up. Because a lot of Russian identification of themselves is Orthodox. But this also actually presents a problem in the identification of Russianness in Manchuria, because in fact, a lot of the people who were classified administratively as Russian were not Orthodox Christians, Orthodox Russians. They were Muslims, or they were non-Orthodox, or they were even Buddhist, and so on. So what unites them is language. And this goes back to something that I think Jan Goldstein mentioned in her article about, in AHA about Ernst Rummel. She was really puzzled by his, holding simultaneously two ideals, the idea of equality, human equality, and a kind of philological thinking that had led to racial thinking. But in fact, I think there are ways of saying that they're through for null, what actually reconciles these two parts is language. Language as well as evolved formation. So for the people, church is important, religion is important. And there's always this sort of implicit idea that orthodoxy is in fact the most important attribute of Russianness. But there are other ways to be Russian too. So again, these kind of multiple elements that come into play. Depending on the situation, something becomes more prominent, other things more sort of hidden. And so religion comes in those. The other thing to say about religion is that the Russians, now I have to put Russian in quotes, is the self-understanding is that you should respect place, we leave their temples in place, we leave their burial grounds in place, and so on and so forth. That's what they profess. And it's this self-understanding of absolute respect for everything else's religion. Should I run through a whole bunch, or do you want to talk about the church? And race as biological race, well, I think it's very clear the idea of, as I say, race is an implicit category for the people, they think of themselves as Europeans, they would say we're white, we're not yellow, but they wouldn't use the word race. And they'll say we're not coolies because we're Europeans, and we're Russians, and we're not coolies, and so on and so forth. And so is it a biological category? I don't think they really thought about that. What they do think is they like to classify their ethnic others as if they've always been there as primordial groups. And what's really interesting is to think of the indigenous as the Chinese. When in fact the Chinese are really relatives from 1890s and so on, 20th. So they're indigenous because they look different. The other is to classify the Manchus as a ethnic group. And so the Manchu, because the Manchuria is supposed to be the cradle of Qing dynasty, the kind of preserve, that royal, homeland. That's why immigration was forbidden until the 1890s. Until the Russians started to move in, then the Qing government opened up immigration. But before that, and even after that, to be a Manchu means you can simply register as a Manchu. And you consider yourself politically a Manchu. So you can be a Han Chinese and register yourself as a bannerman, considered a Manchu. And I don't think, so ethnographic study, once you sort of think about ethnos, you sort of don't think about the administrative part where you can make yourself that category. And to the administrators, ascribing those categories, to the people registering themselves, it's a question of, well, what kind of provision do I get? What kind of land do I get? What kind of access to certain kind of privilege do I get? Well, that sounds good, I'll be a Manchu. So it's I don't know, it just doesn't come into the miscegenation. It doesn't come up so much in the paper, although I think it's a kind of silence of what actually happens if everything goes on, especially with human-bearing well-off Chinese. I think it's a silencing of that. It's part of this literature of sort of saying, we're Europeans, we don't do that. Anxiety, affiliation, and primordial, I think the whole indigenation leads to separation. The separation of saying, that's them, that's not us. They are, we show you. So, gender dynamic, I want to just mention one thing, which is masculinity. How masculinity is played out through the activity of hunting. So, when Russians hunt, it's a kind of display of masculinity. When in an indigenous hunt, it's bestiality. So it's where, gender and something else can work together. And so, yeah, gender is absolutely, I don't think you can talk about race without talking about gender.
Sure. Thank you so much for your comments. And in fact, in some ways, you are a very qualified person to comment on this particular case for me, because Goncharov does write about actually Spanish rule in Manila, but it didn't quite make it into this particular paper. I'd say on the question of civilizing mission and the church, in a way, it was key for Spain. It also played a role in Siberia, at least in the way that Goncharov, my author, writes about this. In his Siberia chapter, there are two heroes of Russian civilizing mission in Siberia. One is the agricultural Russian settler, and the second one is the Russian missionary. So they both are given, are spoken of in very appreciative terms. However, the image of civilizing, excuse me, the image of civilizing Siberia in this work has mostly to do with transforming the nomads into settled agriculturers. So that was really key. It wasn't really about making them Christian. It was about that tying them to the land and getting them used to kind of, European style farming. I guess I don't have too much to add about the question of miscegenation. What I already said. I mean, I think there's silencing there as well, just like you mentioned. One thing that I would say, in actually, with a Spanish connection, Goncharov is absolutely stumped why an imperial Spanish government would make any big deal about when a Spaniard was born, like whether you're born to Spanish parents in Spain or you were born to Spanish parents in Manila. He's just completely stumped about this. Why would that matter to anyone? So, so I thought that was an interesting connection. And in terms of gender, I think yes, of course, we have this sort of something that has been spoken about, this idea of feminizing lower races, right, as weaker, more feminine, not as manly and active and virile and all of those things. What I found really interesting is looking at the Japanese accounts of the Russians, and they're doing exactly the same things, right? So the Japanese look effeminate to the Russians, and the Russians look effeminate to the Japanese, which I think is really interesting. So I think that's, yeah, mostly our, I think you make a great point about this idea of a public, you need an audience to which you display your identity or your race or whatever it is that, whatever it is you want to, however you want to define your identity. I think that really is true. What I find interesting about this particular travelogue is that all of us who work on Russia are completely used to the idea that Russians are so torn about, are we European or are we Asian? Who are we? Are we fully neither one nor the other, right? But in this particular work, right, when the topic of is Russia in a global context, we as one imperializing nation among others, when there's a sort of Russia put on a global stage, there's absolutely no hesitation anywhere in this 700-page long text about Russians being 100% European, right? And I think it does have to do, like, identity is not some sort of an essential quality that you are. It depends in what context you assert it, with respect to whom. So I think that here, that's why we have this like absolutely unequivocal and unambivalent self-presentation of Russianness as 100% European. So.
Okay, just one word about public and what you mentioned that was very interesting. Who were they displaying themselves to? The public here, I think, is the other Europeans in the area, including the Japanese. To be able to say that they're not, the very same people who say they're not indigenous. And that's in a contemporary setting. Later on, in the emigre writings, when it's coming out retrospectively, it's to, sort of in a sense, to other Russians if they published it in Moscow, or to their American audience if they published it in English, or to other emigre Russians and their children if they published it outside of Russia in Russian. So there's this, but it's never, we all include the region, sort of indigenous groups.
Okay, we will open the floor to discussion, and I know that David has been bursting at anything.
Yeah, thanks to the papers were both fascinating, and thanks, Caterina, for the commentary. I think it was really insightful to kind of hear the way that you read these papers. And my first question, I think, is to you, or at least I would like to have your thoughts about this. So you mentioned the kind of obsession in the Spanish case with taxonomizing these miscegenation and differences, even if it's not a biological race, right? And from the perspective of the Russian field, this is kind of one of the ways you might think about the hang-up with talking about race in Russia, is that there wasn't this taxonomizing of race, right? It never was an official category, it still isn't an official category, and so on. And so in understanding modern scientific racism, or the category of race in Spain, there's sort of, you kind of fall into it, at least from my end, it seems like that, right? If you go back to these early modern posters of taxonomies, you go, oh, of course they think about race, because look what they were doing in 1550. The Russians don't have that. And so the question for coming to the 19th century period is, when we clearly encounter these cases of people thinking about race, is it the same thing? Is it the same thing? So we're documenting that they're talking in racial terms, and that they're thinking in quasi-biological terms, or bodily terms at least, and so on. But the question is, what does that mean, given the fact that there's not this, again, I mean, this is kind of coming out of some ignorance of the Spanish case, but it seems to make so much sense in the Spanish case, where you have this long history of colonial taxonomies. And I guess my question is, with your reading of these papers, so they're talking about race, but is it the same thing, given the absence of that long kind of administrative history? And then just one more point to pick up on this public idea, which I think is really useful to think about the kind of audience for this. I mean, Edyta's reception history, or gesture at the reception history of this book, is a start to that, and I think a really important one, because it helps us to move beyond, okay, so Goncharov is, talking in these terms. Why does it matter? Almost kind of a social historical precondition for answering that question is, well, were people reading it? And how were they reading it? And you mentioned in your paper some of the redacting that happened at various points, and that's also crucial, right? They're taking some of this stuff out, which also tells you something of what they thought about it, and the kind of politicization of this racial discourse. And Chia, you are also talking in a way about the reception, as you just mentioned. At the end of your paper, you suggest that these developments that you're describing are a kind of Russian critique of European colonialism. So this Russian style of racializing is the second position race is a kind of, and my question to you is, how do you know that that's the audience? So, and who's making that critique? So if you're going to read this as a Russian critique of European colonialism, who is it who's making that critique? How do you understand it to be a critique? And who cares from the perspective outside of Manchuria what Russian kind of conceptualization of race are doing? Or do the Europeans care if the Russians are criticizing their style of colonialism? So thank you again for this chat.
Do you want to respond to that, or should we move on to take more questions? Susanna?
Yeah, I just have brief questions for each of you. So two brief questions for Edyta and one brief question for Chia. So yeah, thank you for a wonderful Frigate Pallada. I mean, we're both fans of it.
That's right.
We're both early fans, and yeah, I love the text, and I learned a lot about your paper. I still want to question that about the ambiguity part. Because, so yeah, you stress that, which is a little different from my positions, that Goncharov is unmistakably, unapologetically European. But I would still like to question that, is he that comfortable with his Europeanness? Because, especially in moments when the Russian imperialist wars collides with any other European imperial trajectories, that it seems to me that it falls apart pretty quickly. And the argument that I made in my announcement was that it's almost like he's wearing borrowed clothes, and he's basically a Russian man traveling in an English world. The itinerary. But yeah, it just seems to me, I mean, it's essentially borrowed clothes. And sometimes he wears it long enough to be comfortable in it. But it's soon, there are many moments, it seems to me, that it feels, I don't know, especially when, and there are a lot of parts that Goncharov is very silent about, right? Technical deficiencies, the amazing difficulties that the whole journey went through, the glaring contrast between the technological superiority of the English, their management. So it's almost, so yeah, if you could say something about that. And then the other one is, and the other one is, I was struck by your, the quote of Nabokov, really classifying this middle brow, right, emotion. So, I don't know, I'm not sure if this is even a question, but especially the race part, especially when it comes to high Russian literature and culture and low Russian literature and culture, it seems to me there's like a real difference, and especially in the part of the high literature. They're very funny about race, so if you could say something about the differences, how race is treated differently in high and middle brow culture, because I think it's really important that Book qualifies as middle brow, and this is what middle brow literature does. It's very racist and stereotypical, and there's a sense that, because as you know, Goncharov has a kind of exceptional status in Russian literature. He wasn't, as it seems to me, as accepted by his other Russian literary peers, and his Russian background and many of, which is also exactly what makes him so receptive. So, for instance, if Dostoevsky had been on this trip, it would have been a completely different. It took big a while. So Goncharov is there's something unusual about. I said Goncharov is compared to other high literature Russian representatives that we consider. So those are the two things. And then Cheyenne, the really brief question is one. I read the paper, and one little thing that threw me off was that. So they're competing with Japanese industry as imperialists, and they're both competing to Europeans in the Manchurian stage. So if you could comment a little bit on that, and I was kind of a little taken aback by the fact that a lot of the Russian projects, the resources and museums actually emulate the ones that the Japanese did. So how does that, I don't know, how does that impact the race relations in the East-West, right? And it seems like both Japanese and Russians are competing for that Westernness and that white Europeanness in Chinese insurance space.
Thank you. You guys want to respond?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Susanna. These are great questions. You're absolutely right on the question of the European identity. When I say that it's 100% European, I'm saying about sort of the projection that he wants, the image that he's projecting. I'm not reading this sort of all the subterranean anxieties about whether in fact European that we might find in the book. And actually, if we look at the not the Frigate Pallada, but in the correspondence, private correspondence, we actually find much more of it, right? The ambivalence about, well, I'm not quite sure how much European we are. But I'm saying about the sort of the loudspeaker image extracted from this text is one of, we were unequivocally included in this literature. But I agree with you that you can read passages of this, parts of this work to see these sort of moments of hesitation, or he's not quite sure, or insecurity about this, about the sort of, again, it's the image that he tries very strenuously to project as a who is speaking, we Europeans.
Yeah.
So it's whenever he goes to, he's in Hong Kong, and he's, in all these places, whenever it's we Europeans, whenever he says we Russians are included, we Europeans, Russians are always included in it. But you're right about these subtexts.
Especially since the last leg of the journey coincided with the inception of the war. And so
Yeah.
there are, moments when he was actually quite in danger. And so, yeah, that I think plays a lot into the right.
Although that doesn't, I don't think it plays into the idea of identity, right? But I mean, okay, so we're all European. Europeans argue about territorial possessions. So yeah, we fight over things. You know, the French and the British fought over in India, right? And here we are fighting over Crimea. You know, so I don't think that particular, the Crimean War in itself, introduces a sort of complication into the question of identity. But your point is very well taken. Thank you. I want to clarify that when I say middle brow is me interpreting what Nabokov is saying. The word middle brow in itself does not appear in the text, but by making it the kind of reading that Luzhin, right, would have made, he was doing, you know, that Luzhin was a kind of middle brow reader. He wasn't a high, sort of a consumer of high Russian literature. You know, I would love to be able to answer a question, you know, how race was perceived in high literature versus middle brow literature. But unless, you know, I'm happy to get your suggestions, but I just don't know of race being much part of literary studies in Russian. I actually don't know of any articles about racial questions in Russian literature. I don't, but if I welcome everyone to give me suggestions. Is it about 20th century or 19th century? Yeah, well, I'm interested, yeah, 19th century stuff.
Dostoevsky, however you interpret.
And race and Haji Murat? Fabulous, okay.
Orientalism.
No, okay, well, Orientalism, that's a separate, that's a separate thing. I want to speak specifically about race.
But Dostoevsky, of course, allowed whether we interpret his comments about Poles and Jews as racial, and we could. In fact, Dostoevsky worked as an appalling quotes about minorities in Russia as terrible stereotyping. So it's not only sort of popular
it's there.
literature.
Yeah, no, it's there, and I've actually
criticized for this kind of
yeah, Dostoevsky actually has quite atrocious things to say about Aryan nation in the Diary of a Writer, right? And we need a war with Turkey to cleanse our Aryan nation of sort of these accrued, I don't know, you know, to invigorate our Aryan race. It's a really good thing to go into a war with Turkey. So I mean, it's kind of a sort of fascistic sentiments. But again, like I haven't seen anyone actually writing about it. So. But yeah, I'll take any tips on things to read about 19th century and question of race that isn't just Orientalism. And you're absolutely right, him as a merchant traveling as opposed to a nobleman traveling is very key.
He was also looked at with contempt by many other Russian writers. I can't say.
Yeah. And so there is a sort of a class prejudice, and actually to make things worse, he was also a government official. At the time of travel, he was an official of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Trade Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So he was on government pay, and what destroyed his reputation with our literary aristocracy was also the fact that a few years after publishing the Frigate Pallada, he accepted the post of a censor, and that's the kiss of death, of course. So, but I think, in a different chapter of this project, a chapter on the visits to the Asian ports, to Hong Kong, Singapore, to Shanghai, I have a chapter on issues of globalization, of imperialism, of free trade, of all this stuff about tariffs and access to ports and global trade. And I think there, what I find very interesting is that we always say that Russian cultural history pretty much sort of third estate, middle class concerns are just totally some back burner, we don't even know where. Well, his position is very much gung-ho about trade, about business, about enterprise, about free trade, and I think his merchant background precisely predisposes him to look upon these quintessential bourgeois, phenomena very sympathetically. So I just thought I would mention that.
Thanks. We have several questions lined up. I want to give Chia a chance to respond to Susanna's question.
And David.
And David's, yes.
So yes, competing with the Japanese to the Western Russians, absolutely. I think there's a kind of Russian idea of belonging that is very much based on performance, and in that case, the Japanese certainly made the grade. And interestingly, in their handbooks, when the Russians in Manchuria published a handbook on Manchuria and the Chinese history, railroad, where they sort of gave surveys of population, they're classified as European and Japanese. So in their mind, there's, they made their mark. And the fact that they won the Russo-Japanese War is a very, very loud proclamation that they made their mark.
Sorry, does that suggest that then we're not talking about race?
No, it does not suggest that.
If the Japanese you said the Japanese were considered European because of their economic and military status.
Yeah, the way they perform is so it's not biological. In my view, it's not at all biological. It's not a biological.
I'm sorry, may I just say it also has a history of biological Europeanness, because when people like Amuchin, the physical anthropologist, when he discusses Japanese race in connection with also Japanese war, in again major Russian regional newspaper that publishes this, he actually is trying to explain why Japan is a European race. And he combines cultural arguments and racial arguments, and this is amazingly interesting exercise in combining the two things. It's 1905 when we're publishing this. This is exactly this naive attempt to use the language of race as kind of very modern scientific language to explain Japan, the phenomenon of Japan, and why Japan and Russia are both European nations, and what is wrong with Japan being a better European nation in this particular case. So, the history of this.
So I understand that Amuchin, sorry, he link it to biology, denies the existence of a yellow race.
He denies yellow race as a self-explanatory category, as something outside of this European domain, as opposed to Europeans as a race. And so he's trying to develop this new language of Europeanness, racial and cultural Europeanness for Japan. It's one of the most confusing pieces by Amuchin, but nevertheless, there is this very articulate attempt to racialize this.
I'm really glad you brought that out, because I think it ties into David's question, or the way I would like to answer David's question, which is about what is the second position on racialization, and who is making a critique of the Russian, who is making a critique of European colonialism, and who cares if the Russians are making a critique of Russian, of European colonialism. So I just want to step back a little bit and say, second position, racism, which is the original tourism, something I took from Caterina, who sort of developed this with other people, and writing a lot about post-colonial racism in France, about how to talk about race in France when everyone denies that race exists. In other words, after 1945, no one wants to admit that race exists. And everyone says, of course we know there's no such thing as race. Of course we understand there's no biological race. Race is not a reality, so how can we talk about race? And so there's this retreat into a different realm, very often cultural. To say, well, actually, we're not talking about the existence of race, the reality of race. We're talking about why certain people don't get along with other people. So the second position, racism, is then an attempt to understand why some people don't culturally fit in. And it becomes a cultural discussion. But it comes out of a reluctance to say we still believe in race, and then you can still talk about biological race as reality. That's been denied. This happened in Europe in 1945, but I think with the Russians this happened way before, much earlier on. And that's probably because Russian intellectuals have always critiqued European development. What is going on from currency number? What is going on in Europe is always a potential mirror of Russia's future. But is that future to be embraced? Not. Very often not, especially with conservative writers. So that critique of Europe has been a critique of industrialism, of market society, of European colonialism as well, which then is understood as exterminationist colonialism. So it seems very, I haven't actually sat down to trace this, but I think quite early on, recent to the mid-19th century, there were a lot of Russian opponents of imperialism will say, we don't carry out imperialism like France or Germany. We assimilate. We're assimilationists.
Yay.
We bring them over, we integrate, we don't exclude, we don't marginalize, we don't exterminate, we don't carry out genocide. And so to me, this critique of Europe has always been, do Europeans care about that critique? Actually, probably not. But the Russians care about that critique. That's their critique of Europe in order to understand who they are. And so assimilation becomes this flag of what is different about Russia compared to Europeans. And assimilation, in a way, ties back to this question of civilizing mission and progress, and race as a category of historical, say, causation. Race and the transformation of race is what pushes history forward. Assimilation is the mechanism by which race pushes history forward. And so, and this is something I think Jack Goldstein talks about in the article. But, and it's something that many people believe. Ernst Renan, all the Russian writers, they believe that assimilation is what's going to bring progress to the world, because the more primitive people will learn how to do things better from the more advanced people. So this is why I also talk about second position racism, because the people who talk about that also, and especially Pierre, he talks about assimilation as equally racialist as extermination or genocidal exclusion. The sense that he calls it, yes, Mr. Jones, anthropology and anthropology. Anthropology is you swallow people up like cannibals. That's assimilation. And anthropology is you throw people up. You don't like them, so you vomit them. And that's extermination or exclusion in very harsh ways. So I think what he's trying to say is neither way is a way of coming to terms with other people. And so Jean-Paul Sartre has has written this work called Reflections on the Jewish Question, which I think goes back to this idea about assimilation. And it's been summarized in a very pithy way by Tony Judd, who said, so this is a very, very short and abbreviated summary of that. But the idea is that in that work, Sartre talks about four kinds of people: the anti-Semite, the inauthentic Jew, the authentic Jew, and the Democrat. So the anti-Semite seeks what he already knows, lives in passion and hate, really doesn't think. Inauthentic Jews tries desperately to assimilate, to integrate, but he will never be treated as anything other than a Jew. The authentic Jew is the one who refuses to integrate and assimilate. The Democrat is the one who believes in universalist rights. But in so doing, he runs the danger of murdering or killing Jewish culture. So Tony just summed this up, I don't know if Sartre actually said it this way, but he says, so summing that up is the anti-Semite kills the man, saves the Jew. By contrast, the universalist saves the man who kills the Jew. So it's a very, so I just want to say that, well, this is the status of sort of certain kinds of writing about race in France.
Yes.
And I think, you know, it's a way of sort of thinking that in some ways, when we think about
I think we have 6 questions lined up, so I do want to open the floor. I know Susan's been wanting to ask a question for a long time. We have Susan, Elena, Vera, Nadia, and I think there was someone else too, so, Daniel, right?
Yeah, Susan Smith here. I enjoyed this panel, very interesting talks. Unfortunately, I wasn't here for the first day. One thing I want to note here, though, is the importance of change over time. I've done a lot of work on Russian America, which is now Alaska, and in looking at the way that colony was administered, and looking at a lot of different sources, I see a shift in the 1860s. Before the 1860s, there really wasn't an interest in the concept of race. They didn't, it's not that they repressed the idea of miscegenation, they called it marriage, right? So they saw that there should be this, there's a whole plan, and they put into place to create a Creole estate, and these were the offspring of Russian or Siberian men and Native women. And so it gets back to one of the things that the discussant said, which was that I think an earlier identity formation was orthodoxy. I mean, these men who were considered Russian were Yakut, some of them were Yakut and others were Siberian. And that whole tradition remained. Now, of course, there were educated people, especially Germans, travelers who came and made racial taxonomies. But in terms of the people who were there administering, there really wasn't this sense of racial difference. I mean, there was a sense that, in fact, there was a sense that the Creoles should be the ones to create a Russian civilization. That the Russians themselves were not able to do it, and of course obviously the natives couldn't, but the Creoles would create this Russian civilization. So I think that there is a difference between the early 19th century and the later 19th century. I'm just curious to see what that.
I'm actually going to bundle a couple of questions now. So we have Susan, and I'll just move this way, but I promise I'll get you all. Nathaniel.
Thanks. Very interesting comments, papers. Fascinating. Yes, I have first for Cheyenne, I'm curious about how the perceptions of hierarchies within these groups, the indigenous and the Europeans, or the Russians, fit into these larger dichotomies, were distinctions made among these indigenous between different levels of status, and were there areas where crossings were possible. And also within the Europeans themselves. And particularly, I know from some of your other work that you have these Russians who are coming after the Civil War, often in very dire situations, not in a position of status at all. And how were these kind of gradations registered, and did they fit in as well? Question for Edyta. Well, first of all, just a slight clarification. I really don't say that it was the very end of the 19th century that you don't see this. At least I really see it's more the 1850s, the 1860s as the beginning of this sort of moment of resonance where you begin to see racial discourses becoming more prominent in Russia. But 2 more specific questions. I'm curious about the milieu that Goncharov was in and on the frigate Pallada. I suppose I should read the book and find it out myself. It's on my list. But I mean, I know this is sponsored by the Naval Ministry, right? And I know the Naval Ministry had a very strong Baltic presence. Vrangel was the leader of it. Edyta is very strongly involved. You've got people like Krusenstern as well.
Earlier,
so
yes.
He's earlier. I think he's still alive. Right. But so how Russian were these Russians? And were they Russian or were they Rossiyski? And did that, you know, how did that?
They insisted
how did
that
that
they
work?
are Russian. They knew
Yeah,
and they insisted.
Okay, these questions actually seem to go together pretty well, so why
Yeah.
don't I
Just,
so
yeah,
just
just one other
one
very
more
quick
thing.
question.
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
just curious about the literary models that may have informed the genre of travel literature as he's writing it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so why don't we keep those two questions together because they go together pretty well and brief response about starting with the Edyta.
Okay.
Sure.
The milieu of the, there's about close to 500 people on the frigate Pallada. Most of them are sailors, recruits from, you know, the lower classes, common people. Among the officer crew, well, we have Yevgeny Putyatin, married to an English woman, supposedly a raging Anglophile. We have merchant origin, Goncharov. We have I mentioned this as one of the episodes of the story I'm telling, is that most of the last names of the high officer crew who identified as themselves as Russian are, you know, French, Bossuet, Bosquet, Weyrich, Grudner, you know, German. So a lot of them are Baltic Germans, which is consistent with the staffing of the voyages of exploration in the Russian Empire, starting with Guzenstern. Putyatin was trained in the British Navy, as was Guzenstern, as was Litka, I believe. In addition, so we have a Ukrainian Goshkevich, a Russian from Ukraine. We have our archpriest Avakum, who served in the Beijing, what do you call it all the time? In the mission Peking, it was that called at the time, I guess, right? So he served in the ecclesiastical mission in China. There are a number of Dutch interpreters, right? In order to speak with the Japanese, they needed to bring Dutch interpreters. That was the language of diplomacy with Japan. And these tended to be, I think Bossuet, was served as a translator, and so it's a multilingual crew composed of all kinds of, a lot of them Baltic Germans, you know, some people from Ukraine. Goshkevich actually sounds to me like a Polish name, possibly. And in terms of literary models, well, there's a sort of a copying, but also partial refuting of Karamzin, letters of the Russian traveler. So there's a sort of attention with that as a literary model. We have traces of Pushkin's journey to Arzum. These are the key, I think, to travel narratives. Now, that said, the library of the ship was stacked full of literary travelogues in all kinds of European languages, and I'm going to have an appendix in my book about listing of all the works, Western European sources that I know Goncharov read. Oftentimes these sources are referenced, directly referenced in the book. Okay, I read such and such book, and there I read this and that, right? So, as Simon Gikandi writes about in this book, Maps of Englishness, travel narratives were often sort of reworkings of the colonial library. And we have a number of sources that are specifically invoked in the narrative. There are other ones that, scholars said, well, he's talking about this, or he picked this information from here. A lot of them are late 18th century travel accounts, some of them early 19th century sources, some of them very, very current stuff that Goncharov did some book shopping when he was in London in 1852, the fall of 1852. So he bought, for example, he knew he was going to Cape Colony, so he bought a bunch of books about the Cape Colony in London, and he's reading these things. One of the ways of killing, dull sailing, long sailing distances would be to basically prep for encounters with, Shanghai or with Southern Africa by reading all these travel accounts.
Does he pick up Kovalevsky's account of his voyages over the Upper Nile?
No. No, I haven't
When
heard.
did the voyage begin? Sorry.
1852. They set out,
Kovalevsky's 2 years earlier.
Yeah, I haven't seen that mentioned, but he certainly read Kuzenstedt. He certainly read Golovnin's account of Japan. These are, very well documented sources.
Do you have a brief response
To the hierarchy question?
Sure.
Yeah, there are two ways of hierarchy, of creating hierarchy or how they were constituted. One is by occupation, the other one is by religion, broadly speaking. So in that community, that I said, in the Lounsbery community, the occupation of Железный дорожник is definitely very high up, because those are the people who are very well employed, who are technical experts, who are professionals, who are generally well trained in the revolutionary period, and they were highly respected if they got a job on the railroad. That creates a whole group of people who have very privileged standards compared to other people. Religiously speaking, because of the presence of Orthodox churches, physical presence in everywhere, many of them were built just by physical presence is a dominant sort of formation, kind of identity. By population count, I think most people were Orthodox Christians among the Russian community. So then this means is who is not at the top. There are other groups, other religious groups. There are, for instance, Russian Jews who, and in fact, many people who talk about Russian now used to be Jews who lived in Russia, then moved to Harbin, then moved to Israel. But their story in Harbin really don't sort of connect very much with the stories that Russian emigres tell of Harbin. So somehow they're there, they're not there. They're considered Russian because they spoke Russian, but they're not really considered in every dimension of their life as Russian. Parts of them are Russian, parts of them are not. People who follow different kinds of living, ways of living, coachmen, prostitutes, beggars, people who tutor Russian language, Chinese, they're not really there. So this hierarchy seems to, it's by occupation, by religion, by language.
Thank you very much. Okay, I promise I'm moving this way, Edyta and the other ones.
Chia, I really like how these papers focus on making Europeanness and performing Europeanness, figuring out what does that mean in relation. And so I'm trying to fit in a couple of other pieces that I'm not an expert on, but I'm curious about what you think about specific relations to European networks of writers and policy makers and aristocrats. So on the one hand, right, I agree, Bolivar seems really important and applicable to the case in thinking about second position, race, and racialization. And still, another thing I'm wondering if this is also germane. So Russians, people consider themselves Russian, or you want to define that, they've been reading Enlightenment philosophers for a long time. They've been reading, right, we know it's not just a concept of race that they're reading about how Europeans racialize Russians. And so there's something also, a second order or reaction to going back to Montesquieu, right, when he takes the tongues and freezes them and cuts them sideways to see which nations' papiae are more firm, and therefore which nations have greater sensitivity in the northern versus the southern, and he declares, he says, a Muscovite has to be flayed before he feels anything. Right? So there's this whole, there are a couple of centuries of being characterized by European quasi-race thinkers and proto-race thinkers. So there's that on one hand. And then another thread that might be related, and I'm not sure if it is, it seems to have to do with connections amongst the aristocracy across the nations. And we've talked a lot about intermarriage in the hinterlands, but these aristocratic marriages seem distinctly configured in Russia insofar as people like Tolstoy would pick them out as instances of pockets of alienness it was the aristocracy that wasn't sufficiently Russian for some people. And so I thought, is there something really interesting there in how those writers, how these people are performing Europeanness that is dealing with these kinds of I don't know what to call it, disruptive, something, they're a little bit disruptive to how, say, the English are thinking about race. They're not worrying about whether the Habsburgs are infiltrating the Windsors, right? The Windsors are the Windsors, but there are Windsors and the Romanovs, but how does that all get absorbed and understood differently in the Russian case when there's this fear of becoming the Slavic race?
Thank you. Yeah, would you like to add a question? And then we'll.
Yeah, actually, to add to, in a way, what Elena in the comment was saying, that of course it's not only Russians who feel kind of defensive in terms of this kind of their rationalization by Europeans, Germans as well. French, there's French racial work saying that actually the Germans are not properly Europeans, and it only, in a way, makes them defend their Europeanness through anthropological work. It doesn't kind of prevent them, the Germans and I mean the Russians, from engaging in racial theories. But I have a question to Edyta, and it's about, basically the question is how we study, because you said that we wanted to look at through Frigate Pallada is the kind of more the race of popular culture rather than high culture. But to me, Frigate Pallada isn't a popular culture. This is kind of middle ground culture, which is also read by people engaged in high culture, particularly in the 19th century. So basically, a very broad kind of readership, the people who read this kind of work are educated people, not peasants. But there is something, and in general, that's the question how we study kind of perception of a particular kind of race, in this case, in popular culture, in relation to the past, what we use. And there is something in your article which I found fascinating, and there's a discrepancy between representations in the published work, and in the correspondence, and in particular in relation to this question of miscegenation in Siberia. And if I understood you correctly, in Frigate Pallada, Goncharov presents the kind of dominant view in 1856-9 view of this racial mixing. But in fact, in the private correspondence, am I right? He's presenting a much more negative view of the Yakuts. And what does this discrepancy, I think, is important for studying popular culture. So in a way that you have already in the published work, it's political correctness, or you have a self-censorship. You can't express a kind of educated person can't express very loaded, racially sort of loaded negative stereotypes about our own Inarotsi. But this experience, first-hand experience, makes him fall back to particular stereotypes. And of course, there's very similar dynamics at work today, not just in Russia, but in sort of other societies. So how would you interpret this discrepancy? What, in your view, we can read? How we can read into this discrepancy to understand this problem of perception.
Well, I think for sources of popular culture, first of all, the first thing that I would do for the 19th century is go to a book by Bovik Balmantu, NLO publication.
The name was,
The sort of the main person is the sociology of Russian literature.
and humor.
Yes. We corresponded. Okay, the name is Bovik Balmantu. Veinblad, that's right. Yes, Veinblad. And he has a very, very nice, very handy listing of by decade, or I think by even by year, what were the most popular books at the time. Now, that isn't maybe fully reliable because I think he focuses on fiction. So I think the travelogues fall off the wayside. Another thing that we could do is basically look at the serialized literature, and I know it's huge, right? Because we're talking about a centuries basically worth of Russian journalism, but there's no other way. This is actually the most important cultural vehicle in Imperial Russia, and in fact, one of the arguments that Reiblatz makes for the 19th century, at least for the sort of early and mid 19th century. In last decades, it becomes less true, that if you want to gauge popularity of a given text in that period, book editions is in fact not the thing to look at. Instead, it's which journals things were serialized in, what circulation they had at the time, because the Fig Journal was the key vehicle of Imperial Russian culture. And again, this becomes less true for when the literacy rates rise and publication, more things get published, readership rises in the last decade. So that's what I would say. And yes, I mean, these discrepancies for me are fascinating, and I wish that I had the epistolary evidence for this Goncharov is extremely spotty. As Katya Pravilova shows in her book, she explores this in her most recent book, Public Empire. Yes. Goncharov basically wanted all his corresponders, people with whom he corresponded, to destroy all of his letters. He did not want them, put in a collection for scholars to study. So actually, the epistolary evidence for Goncharov is very spotty. However, we do have this a set of very nicely put together letters of Goncharov by Engelgard in one of the 1930s. So I think for Siberia, we happen to have a fairly extensive series of letters where it didn't come out as much in this chapter, but in my Siberian chapter, I talk a lot about how he basically self-censors himself, writing to his friends. He said, okay, Russian colonization of Siberia, dismal failure. Okay, Yakutsk, what a horrible town. And we have this Russian krepos all in ruins, and all it happens is that basically Yakut women go into their private they use it as an open air toilet. Okay, so he has all kinds of very negative things and very critical things to say about the successes of the colonization of Siberia privately. And he also has much more racialized descriptions of Siberia, says, having bare fur instead of hair, and their facial features being, horrific and all of that. He's very careful not to let that into the published text, right? And my theory about this is that it precisely has to do with, all the populations, all the ethnicities of the Russian Empire. I'm not saying it's true for every writer, for every era, okay? But here in this instance, I think, what we deal with is that all these people are basically Russians in the making, assimilation, right? They could soon become Russians, hence we can't really vilify them too much, right? Racialize them, vilify them, because they have to be amenable to Russification and something, or Russianization in some sense, right? So you can't. So making them other is counterproductive for imperial policies in Siberia and elsewhere, right? So that's what I would say. Just one thing, this whole, I'm seeing this like basically a model of Russia's self-descriptions in the 19th century. So we have racism without race, and then we also have empire without imperialism, we have colonies without colonialism, and Mark Rife actually is the person who I think initially brought attention to this idea of like empire without imperialism. And we need to do something about that sort of, I feel that it begs for comment, that kind of cultural self-description of these like apparently, like faulty dichotomies or like false pairs, like one part of the is missing, So And on deception of assimilation, one other thing that I would say, very much in line with what you're saying, the thing that we have to, I feel, this is my own idea, I haven't read it in Bolivar, but the thing that we have to understand about assimilation involves a hierarchy of identities, okay? To say that, okay, I want you, Chuvash, to become a Russian is a hierarchy of identities because it's not valuable to be Chuvash, it's much more valuable to be Russian, so why don't you become Russian, okay? So I don't really feel that assimilation is this sort of like, a happy multiculturalism type of thing, like, are we all equal and why don't you just become like us? Like, it involves a hierarchy of identities whereby the Russian identity is considered to be superior and more desirable and all these other wonderful things.
Do you have a brief response because I want to get to our last question?
Sure. Aristocratic marriage, absolutely. And this is where miscegenation has its sort of a flowery. Because you look at the aristocratic names, Tunisia, Navishi, Rousseau, all these people, it just goes on and on and on. It goes back to the 15th century. And the people who bear this name know that their forebears were Tatars, and so on and so forth. So assimilation has a very positive value. Except they understand assimilation as in a sense becoming Russian. So how this happens, I don't know, but it's there and it's absolutely everywhere. And that self-awareness is in a way sort of the root of European critique of Russians as well, that these are Tatars, they're not Europeans. But then they valorize the critique, so it becomes sort of important considerations. Europeanness. In order to do so, you need a script, you need a public. So it needs the script sort of performs, and then performing the script means you're recognized by other people who understand the script, other Europeans. What is the understanding of what is the nature, what is the character of a European as a script, and what constitutes this understanding of the character of European. It comes from all sorts of different places. So I have to go back to Sartre in his way. So second position racism, in fact, critiques that racism without telling us where to go from there. It kind of leaves us there. And so everyone's racist, everything's racist, what do we do? And they don't say. Sartre, I think actually says something about it. So he's a critic of Enlightenment essentialism in the sense that it is through Enlightenment that there's this need to know what is the nature of peoples. What is the nature of this group of people? What is the nature of this group? So in place of Enlightenment essentialism, what he proposes is thinking of people as having a shared condition, a shared situation. We're in a situation together. That situation may be hunger. That situation may be plenitude. That situation may be all sorts of things, but it's a condition. It's not a nature. So I guess the critique is when you start to look for nature, and however that way, how you seek the bottom. In a sense, it's trying to understand a way to. I think some people have said this in yesterday's comments as well. It's sort of trying to have a key to meaning, so you can understand things before you actually experience it. And that's why he calls an anti-semi, someone who seeks something he already knows. So you don't know. You're in a condition you don't know. And this is, and to many people, this is an epistemological crisis. You don't tell, you don't wonder. And we try to look in epistemological order. We try to go to this proof of being.
Thank you.
Well, just for the sake of complicating
So, well, first of all, I'm not a specialist in Russian literature, but there is a historical fact that Dostoevsky was the best friend of John. He was a Kazakh historian, Kazakh archaeologist, Kazakh enlightenment, and so on and so forth.
Could you speak more loudly, please? Sorry.
Yes, well, Dostoevsky was the best friend of John Anton, just where, for example, other Russian Orientalists like Tolstoy, like Matanin, and
people who pretty much promoted Churgan Varicolored to become a member of the Russian Geographical Society. And Simonov Tinshansky recommended Churgan Varicolored as the head of a very important expedition to Kulja, so to the eastern Turkestan, and after which Churgan Varicolored became a very poet, and he came up with a volume of travel, how he spent the time and researched the local population. And what I should also mention in this respect, that Dostoevsky, Vygotsky, Katanin, they were time and again talking about assimilation. Assimilation of a narod. And that's, in my opinion, another very important category which needs simply specific context. So we have to talk about and understand what the Russians meant, especially these people living in this time. What was assimilation? What was meant under assimilation? It was, in fact, Russian education. So, and Patanin and Yadrtsev especially, time and again wrote in these very important books about it's only through Russian education how these educated narodцы would be able to save their own people. They would be able to pull these people from poverty, from backwardness, from darkness, and all these bad things. So, in fact, there was very little about ethnic assimilation. Rather,
I'm actually going to, we have I have several questions lined up, and we have
okay,
10 minutes.
so just I'm rounding up. In fact, what they were talking time and again about, it was cultural assimilation. And more specific terms, Russian education, which in those days, and Varicolored died in 1855. So what it meant, in fact, it was Russian or European education. So that's how was Russianness and Europeanness also understood and conveyed, at least by this educated society, members of educated society. So it was assimilation, but in fact it was pretty much integration into this educated society.
Okay. Thank you very much. Nadia, do you want to?
For Edyta, very short, I didn't have a chance to read your paper, so forgive me if this is in there, but first, what about Russian translations and readings of canonical texts like Uncle Tom's Cabin or My Lead, which are so crucial in forming us? We're not like this, we're this. Russian readings of Lombroso's theory of the criminal type and the racializing of the criminal type. This was translated into Russian numerous times. And finally, anything that Griboyedov wrote before he was chopped up into little pieces. Wow.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great set of suggested readings. I have no idea when Uncle Tom's Cabin was translated into Russian. Anyone else?
Very
Someone knows that. Someone would know that.
Dr. King will know.
1859.
Yeah, 1859.
That's
Okay,
when
post
that's when it first
Goncharov.
appeared, So
Post
right when-
Goncharov.
Right around, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not quite sure where to take it, but if I may, to cycle back to Alina's question about where was that? About the sort of Russians as also racialized others. We see that in the Cape Colony in Southern Africa, when word gets spread around that. Hey, Russians are in town, Russians are in town. So people, at a certain point where they're in the hotel where the Russians are staying, there comes in this this person, and he was very curious to see a Russian in flesh for the first time. And the way that this character is introduced is by, he has an interest in phrenology and natural sciences and all these disciplines that we associate with the emergence of racial science, right? So, and then it's a very interesting episode because Goncharov is very indignant. It's like, what do you mean? We are a type? Absolutely not. Look, how are we Russian? Look at our names: Bossuet, Krudner, Whitehead. What kind of Russian? What kind of Russian type are we? In fact, I and only one other person, the Dashkevich from Ukraine, are the only two, Russians. Which but what he means by that is basically Slavic, right? So he's very indignant about sort of being lumped into this some sort of like a Russian type. How dare you essentialize us? Basically, is what he's saying, right? But of course, he has. But the interesting thing of this travelogue is that you know, it has this sort of like all kinds of scattered, really interesting insights and little, you know, his lines of thinking that go in really interesting directions, but they're never brought into a sort of coherent, intellectually coherent, logically coherent view. There's a lot of ambivalence, there's a lot of sort of ambiguity, there's a lot of, you know, contradiction, right? So you know, Goncharov is upset about being reduced as a Russian type, but at the same time, he has no problems, you know, essentializing and, you know, treating other types as pure types. When he, you know, the Japanese as a pure type, or the Malays as a pure type, or the Chinese as a pure type, right? And there's an interesting moment in the travelogue when he commits a faux pas during a dinner at a American consul in Shanghai, who, by the way, was at the same time a Russian and basically a plenipotentiary of the Russian government and of the French government and a head of a major American corporation. Right, and he basically, Goncharov assumes that the Russians and Americans are the same, and someone sort of politely you know, corrects him, and he's like, well, you know, like, they pray the same, they speak the same, they hate each other just the same, but who can tell them apart, right? So again, like, you know, ethnologic discrimination matters when you're the subject being, you know, typecast or categorized, but it's sort of more dispensable with dealing with other populations. Like they can sort of, you know, you can group them in bigger units.
Chia, do you have a response?
No, I don't.
Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, excuse me. It's as much a comment as a question. I wanted to speak in favor of assimilation. You know, at the very least, you're not getting killed either by the state or by settler colonials. So that's an advantage.
Yeah, there's that.
There is that. No, but seriously, I think we're using assimilation much too loosely and broadly here. I mean, it is certainly hierarchical, as you said. But there's a huge range of possibilities and policies connected with assimilation, and I think these need to be disentangled rather than just blanketly say there's something terrible about assimilation. I mean, just to give one example, there is something to that French Republican tradition that certainly some people who are of Vietnamese background or North African background could avail themselves through the French educational system. So it's just, it's too easy to simply condemn assimilation. I think that it really needs to be broken down.
I don't wanna sort of poop the whole idea of assimilation. But as a project, as a realistic and even a desirable option for people, but all I wanted to point out is that there's an inherent hierarchy.
Absolutely.
That comes with it. And, you know, I've assimilated to American culture. I'm not American by birth, right? So, right, exactly. So, you know, I don't, you know, I totally agree with you that it could be a viable and a desirable thing for individuals to do. I just wanted to mention that this, you know, the notion of hierarchy is part and parcel of assimilation.
I think actually it is 12 o'clock, and that's a very good high note to end on. So I think we can continue. Would you have to, just maybe one, yeah, I feel bad about
I just want to say, in answer to your comment on assimilation, I am by Southwest category involved in Chinese.
Well, thank you very
This
much.
is how important these are.